Hey guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to bring you my November reading wrap-up, and as some of you may know, I was participating in Nonfiction November this month, and I did indeed read only nonfiction this month. I guess I read a poetry collection at the end, but it was pretty memoir-ish nonfiction type poetry. And it wasn't even that hard. I love nonfiction, as you may know, so let's get started. The first book I read this month was White Trash, the 400-year-old untold history of class in America. And here's the thing about this book. If you somehow are laboring under the idea that America is this pure meritocracy, or that the American dream is a real thing that's available to all people in equal measure, then yes, maybe you should read this book along with a bunch of other books out there about inequality in America. But if you are even a mildly observant person and have realized that America is an intensely classist society, even though we like to pretend that we're not, then I don't know that this book is a must read. I definitely learned some interesting things in terms of where the origins of our sort of classist society came from. You kind of learn about how a lot of the founding fathers were pretty class oriented, including Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. So I found pieces of information like that interesting, but I also think that if you're going to talk about the 400-year-old untold history of class in America, you can't talk about it without talking in a meaningful or rigorous way about the intersection of class and race. That's what I think. I don't think that you can divorce class and race from each other. And if you're only looking at it as this history of class for white people in America, the thesis of the book is kind of that classism exists and that unfettered upward mobility for white people is a myth. And I guess I just didn't find that argument particularly original or particularly revelatory in any way. And maybe it was just that I wanted this book to be something that it wasn't, because I think what interests me most about the white working class in America right now is the intersection of white working class identity and our social and political world, and kind of the implications and consequences of that. And that's something that this book just doesn't really delve into. So in general, I learned some kind of interesting historical facts and tidbits, but I think as a whole, this book isn't a critical must-read. Next up, I read two books by Joan Didion, the first one being The White Album, which is her collection of essays about the late 1960s and early 1970s in America, and the second being Blue Nights, which is her somewhat recent memoir about the death of her daughter Quintana, and more generally about aging and loss and the passage of time. And I found Blue Nights to be particularly gutting, which I found interesting because I think Joan Didion consciously resists sentimentality and sort of doesn't overly indulge herself in her writing, but this book is really heartbreaking in very quiet ways. And I have found that the more I read Joan Didion, the more I appreciate her as a writer and her body of work. I did a whole video about her and the 5 books of hers that I've read so far that I'll link down below if you want to learn more. But yeah, I really recommend both of these books and Joan Didion as a whole. Then I read We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I did a full review on this book, which I'll also link down below. But suffice it to say that this book is beautifully written. It absolutely stands up to all the hype and the praise that's been heaped on it, and it so has its finger on the pulse of America and America's myths and hypocrisies and contradictions, and it is so timely it hurts. So go read it right now. Next up, I read Tiny Beautiful Things, which is Cheryl Strayed's collection of Dear Sugar advice columns that she wrote for The Rumpus. And I didn't like this book as much as I liked Wild, although I think there are some really excellent columns in this book. And I think the thing that's important to remember about Cheryl Strayed is that I think you need to go into her books with an open mind and an open heart, if you will. I think you need to be ready to embrace the sort of earnestness of her advice and the sort of occasionally overwrought style of her writing, because if you go into it cynically and ready to mock her sincerity, I don't think you're going to get what you can get out of this kind of book. I have to say in this book a little bit, it did get a little woo-woo for me at times, and I think that's because the structure of a lot of these advice columns is that she'll get a question from someone and then she'll kind of tell a story from her own life that creates this kind of overarching metaphor metaphor that relates back to what the letter writer's questions or concerns are. And I think sometimes those metaphors work extremely well. I think more than a couple of times in this book, the metaphors are like a stretch. That being said, there are a few columns in here that are absolute knockouts, one of them being The Ghost Ship That Didn't Carry Us, which is about the decision of whether or not to have children, and another one called The Obliterated Place, which is a letter to a father who's grieving the death of his 23-year-old son. Then I read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which is the book that is said to have kind of helped launch the narrative nonfiction or the nonfiction novel genre. It was also a huge bombshell and landmark book in the true crime genre. The book centers around the murder of Kansas farmer Herb Clutter, his wife, and his 2 teenage children, all of whom were killed in the middle of the night in their home by 2 would-be robbers who wanted to leave no witnesses behind. And it was a really violent and seemingly random attack that really shook the small town of Holcomb, Kansas. And the narrative follows a few different threads, one of them being the Clutter family on the last day they were alive, another one being the murderers, and the third thread being the townspeople in Holcomb and how they react to and process the death of this rather prominent family in town. And I think this three-pronged approach is really compelling and gives the book a lot of layers to it that makes it fascinating reading. And I think it means that the victims in this book get a lot more humanity and nuance than a lot of victims in true crime get. My issue with this book, though, is that there's so much emphasis on this story being a true story, and that's kind of the appeal of true crime, is that you're reading about real horrifying events and there's sort of a weird voyeurism in that. But the thing about this book is that it reads more like fiction than nonfiction. And I actually don't think that's a strength at all. There are whole sections of this book that follow the murderers in particular as they're sort of traveling throughout Mexico after the murders and trying to evade arrest. It is certainly compelling and highly readable on a literary level, but there is a sort of reconstruction of scenes and details and dialogue that really begs the question of how much those sequences are based in truth and how much of them are sort of Capote's invention. What I think this book is able to accomplish in terms of literary flair and sort of compelling narrative storytelling, it sacrifices a little bit in veracity. It feels like a book based on a true story rather than actual journalism. And I know that Capote claims to have had 94% recall or whatever it was, and that he didn't need to take notes while he was interviewing people, but I find that a little bit dubious. And also, in the years since this book was published, there's been plenty of evidence and reports suggesting that this book wasn't particularly fact-checked and that Capote may have fabricated entire scenes. And that opens up all kinds of questions about what qualifies as nonfiction, how much liberty authors are allowed to take, and you know, that's a question for another video. But I think in this book, I had a voice in my head the whole time I was reading, wondering how much of this had actually happened and how much of it was completely made up. And I think that that interferes in your reading when you're reading something that proclaims to be nonfiction. All that being said, Truman Capote can really write a fucking sentence, and I think he captures the Kansas landscape and climate in a really sharp and crisp way. And I want to just read you the opening lines of the book because they really are just stunning. He says, "The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside, with its hard blue skies and desert clear air, has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than middle west. The land is flat and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples are visible long before a traveler reaches them." And lastly, I read The Granite PAIL by Lorine Niedecker. Lorine Niedecker is a little-known, underappreciated poet who was the only female member of the objectivist poetry movement. The reason I'm familiar with her and picked up this book is that she is from my hometown and lived pretty much her whole life just outside of town on Black Hawk Rock Island, which is a spot on the Rock River that is incredibly prone to flooding. And I hadn't really read much of her poetry, and I'm not an expert in poetry by any means, but while reading this I did a little bit of research on the objectivist movement, and I think that kind of their aims were sort of clarity of language and an emphasis on sort of stripped down, everyday words and details. And that's something that definitely comes across in the poems in this book. The other thing that this book really captures in a powerful way is her life by the water. This book feels steeped in floodwaters, and it really evoked for me the place that I grew up and kind of the lakes and rivers that are all over the place, and just the fresh water and marshes that permeate a lot of the upper Midwest. So I really loved it for that, but I think a lot of people could appreciate it. And I think she's kind of legit among people who are poets who are in the know. And actually, I was reading the book Bluets by Maggie Nelson, and on page 53, she quotes Lorine Niedecker. So there you go. But I thought I would leave you with the opening lines of one of her most famous poems, which is called Peon to Place. Peon to place, and the place was water. Fish, fowl, flood, water lily, mud, my life. In the leaves and on water, my mother and I born, in swale and swamp and sworn to water. Those are all the books I read in Nonfiction November. What did you guys read this month? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye.